This is Kingdoms of Amalur Re-Reckoning, which, to be fair, is probably the best thing they could have done with that title. And it is, of course, the 2020 remastering of Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning, a open-world RPG that came out in early 2012. I believe it was February, if I recall. And it got kind of some attention when it came out, but it was also inevitably compared to Skyrim, because, of course, this was just a few months after Skyrim released. And as we've seen before, when a mainline Elder Scrolls game releases, it kind of tends to set the sort of sandboxed RPG standard for a while and tends to stick around in the public's mind for a long time afterwards. And so the comparisons were sort of inevitable, even though this game isn't really trying to be an Elder Scrolls-like experience. It's really more akin to something like Fable, honestly, but still, the comparisons were inevitable. And also, to be fair, the game was advertised as having some really big names behind it, including Ken Rolston, one of the lead designers of Oblivion, so perhaps they did invite some of those comparisons themselves by saying that. But yeah, it is an open-world RPG with heavy leanings towards like Gaelic mythology, a sort of Irish influence, and an overall like world design that is very akin to an MMO, honestly, and that's of course famously because the game was intended to be an MMO in its original conception. So the world is sort of a relic of that. It has a very large, just huge open world to explore. And really, it's just sort of a large game in general. And of course, famously, the overall world lore and design was conceived by R.A. Salvatore, the comic writer, designer, the guy that is behind the Spawn comics and some others like that. So I guess really the best place to start in terms of a remaster is, how is it? What have they changed? What's the same? What is remastered? Well, first there was a visual update. The game does have, a graphical polishing up, but to be fair, the game already looked pretty good, and it has a very stylized art style, very similar to Fable, another similarity there. So really there's only so much that graphical polishing can do to it. It does look better, and I think some of the larger differences are in the particle effects and things, which look a little just brighter, glowier, more high definition, less pixelated. But overall, like I said, there's only so much that a graphical update can do for a game with such a stylized art style. It looks better, but not drastically different. And that's really kind of okay, because in my opinion, the graphical style of this sort of Fable, glowy, high fantasy style, really tends to hold up for a while because of how stylized it is. And, just a slight polishing is plenty enough to be, satisfactory in that regard. But this wasn't just a graphical polish update. The remaster has added some other things, namely in the way that the world scaling works, the level scaling of the areas, and the way the loot works has been changed as well. These are theoretically fairly small changes, but because the world is so large and the game is so long, they add up to be actually pretty significant differences in the way that the game feels, in my opinion, in terms of its overall progression and how you level your character up and go through the world itself. So yeah, the first change is in the level scaling. So in the original game, levels of areas were scaled to you when you first entered them, and then they locked that way. There was a level locking system for all the zones. So if you, say, went into an area at level 5, the area would scale to you around level 5 and then lock there. So even if you returned much later in the game at like level 30, that area would still be locked around that level 5 experience. So this led to the original game being quite easy, honestly, because things always locked to like the bare minimum level that you were and never progressed past that. So you got stronger very quickly. It's pretty easy to get super strong in this game because of all the crafting and finding of loot and things. You get strong quick. But when the areas sort of locked at your level when you entered them, it allowed you to explore the large areas of the world pretty easily, and then when you came back there to quest much later, they would still be as they were when you first found them, and you would just decimate everything with no problem at all. So that has been changed. The levels do not lock anymore. The scaling is checked every time you enter them. But they have changed that a little bit too. Normally, I'm not a fan of level scaling. I've said it before. I think it kind of smooths the challenge of the game out to not really have many peaks and valleys, and kind of makes it, almost sort of boring sometimes. But they have tackled that a little bit, which I do like. Areas now have almost, like I said, MMO-like zone level ranges that help to determine what the areas can scale to in accordance to your level, so they can't always be exactly your level, making it possible to still have that nice, satisfying RPG experience of going back to an area that gave you grief early on and just destroying everything because you're overpowered now, and also that nice feeling of being able to walk into something that's very, very strong and just sort of see if you can make it yourself, have like an extra challenge by facing enemies that are probably too hard for you, but you might as well give it a shot now that you're here, right? And those are the kinds of peaks and valleys that level scaling kind of eliminates for me, and I really like those. So the way they've changed it is, not only are areas scaled to your level every time you enter them rather than only once and then locked, but they now each have these level ranges that determine how low or how high they can get. So it's possible to overlevel an area, and it's possible to be underleveled for an area, making the world feel, I guess, a bit more alive, a bit more dynamic, rather than pretty much exactly the same level of challenge all the way through. There is more variance now, which is appreciated and is, like I said, a theoretically small change that actually adds up to be a pretty big change because of how many zones there are and how just much stuff there is to do in this game. It means that the areas are no longer such a cakewalk constantly and helps to increase the overall challenge, you could say. So it is an appreciated change. It's something it's nice that they made it. And the changes to loot are twofold. One is similar to the level scaling change in that in the original game, the level of loot in a container was locked when you entered that area. So if you entered a dungeon and then left at like level 10 and then came back at level 20 and then actually went through it then, all of the chests and rewards and things are going to be scaled to be appropriate for a level 10 character, not the level 20 character that you now are. So you could sort of accidentally screw yourself over by exploring early and then coming back later because you would constantly lock all of the loot containers to your low level so that no matter when you came back they would be no longer appropriate for you. Very much like how the Daedric quests work in the Elder Scrolls games, where it's possible to sort of screw yourself by accidentally doing a Daedric quest so early that you get like a massively inferior version of the artifact and that doesn't scale up to you as you get better. Something that is modded out very quickly in all of those games because it's not very fun. And that was the case here too, but they have changed the containers to now scale to the player when you open them. So it doesn't matter when you first load an area, it only matters when you actually loot the stuff. That way you actually find more stuff that is appropriate for your character's level more often, instead of being able to accidentally lock yourself out of good loot by just walking into a dungeon and then leaving. So another very useful change, very appreciated. And the other change to the looting system is how there's kind of like an invisible item find stat that is augmented when you find stuff that isn't for you. Because there's so much variance, so many variables and so many builds that you can make, and there aren't like classes exactly, I'll explain the Destiny system in a minute, but there's a whole bunch of different builds you can make. That means that there's a lot of gear in-game that may or may not actually be good for you. So now there is a bit of a weighting system that makes it to where you're more likely to find stuff based on the stats that you have increased, so you're more likely to find loot that's better for you. Instead of clearing an entire dungeon and finding like only vendor trash stuff that's not useful for you at all, you're more likely to find stuff that you can actually use. And every time you open a container and you find only like white common rarity items, that sort of augments this invisible item find, magic find stat, you could say, that makes it more likely in the next container to find some higher rarity gear. And this can keep stacking on itself until you find like some super nice epic quality gear for your character and stuff like that. So that means that you're a lot more likely to clear out a hard dungeon and actually come out of it with some high level, high rarity items that you can use, rather than just inventories full of vendor trash, which again is a very appreciated change because it makes the dungeons feel more worthwhile when you're actually getting loot that is good for your character. So what about the actual game itself, rather than just what's new if you've never played it before? It is an open world RPG, third person, not first person, and it has a very hack-and-slashy combat system that's actually pretty fun. There are many different types of weapons, with each sort of class of weapon having its own place in these skill trees when you level up, and also its own combos and unlockable combos. You have like your basic normal, like multi-hit combos. You have like guard attacks, charge attacks, delayed attacks, all sorts of things like that give each of the weapons very much their own identity and their own pretty satisfying, like fluid hack and slashy feel. They're fun weapons, and of course you do have that sort of cleaving effect where you can hit multiple monsters at once, which is always nice in games like this with very hack and slashy combat systems, to be able to cleave through hordes of smaller guys or focus on one guy, which is always useful. And you have lots of different skills and spells that you can learn all on cooldowns. And the skill trees, there are 3 of them: might, finesse, and sorcery. They're pretty self-explanatory, honestly, and they each have a lot of stuff, honestly, with the different like unlockable combos for the weapons that require those stats, and also just new spells and abilities. And really the higher level stuff that you can get later on gets pretty ridiculous. You can do some really powerful stuff. You feel like a force of nature in this game very quickly. You get very strong, but you also face some pretty crazy enemies, and with the new level scaling system, it helps to make those enemies actually feel more threatening more often, which is valued. You can bind up to 8 skills at once for easy use, and you always have 2 weapons equipped on 2 different buttons, and you can use both of the various like combo strings and everything for each weapon, and even switch between them mid-combat. So the combat is nicely varied. It's responsive feeling for the most part, although I do have one major complaint that I'll get onto later. And all of the skills are just nice to look at and fun to use. You also have the Fate meter, that purple meter in between your health and mana, and that is part of the lore of the game, and that you are a sort of fateless being because you have died and have been revived in a way that wasn't supposed to happen, so you are now outside of fate, because of course Irish mythology heavily deals with the idea of fate in general, so being an entity without a fate, you're able to sort of change the world around you in unexpected ways. As you pull off combos and kill enemies, you will get fate points to fill up this meter, and when it's full, you can enter your reckoning mode, which is very much like a sort of, Devil Trigger, Wrath of the Gods thing that makes you just a lot faster and a lot stronger, but also with a bit of a twist that makes it useful for leveling, because when you're in this mode and you actually kill something, it doesn't immediately die, and instead it sort of kneels on the ground, and it starts to, its fate starts to unravel, is what happens, and you can have as many enemies as you can fit on the screen, having all these unraveling fates all at once, and then when you actually want to, you can walk up to an enemy that is unraveling as long as you're still in reckoning mode, and press A to do a ridiculously brutal finishing move on them, and then you'll have to do like a quick time event, and when you pull it off, you will kill that enemy and all other enemies on screen that were having their fates unraveled too, and you will get amplified experience. You'll get up to 100% bonus experience for everything. So this, if done in large enemy waves, or in waves where there are just very hard enemies that are worth a lot of experience, can get you thousands of XP very quickly and help you level up nice and fast. So it's a really good thing to use, not only when you're in a hard combat and you want to be stronger, but when you're like just surrounded by hordes and want to kill all of them at once and get a huge experience bonus. It's actually really fun. I appreciate the system because it gives a different use than expected to the whole super mode thing by actually making it give you an experience bonus too. It's pretty neat, and it is as satisfying as ever, really, as far as this game's combat goes, to actually do that. As far as your leveling and non-combat stuff, you do have a large selection of skills outside of the combat stuff that can be anything from item finding, like hidden detection, that allows you to find secret doors and secret stashes and stuff. It's highly recommended, by the way. Your crafting disciplines, like sage crafting, which lets you craft gems to socket into items. Blacksmithing, there's actually a pretty in-depth crafting system in this game that allows you to combine various components to create new weapons and armors. It's pretty fun. And alchemy, which is pretty self-explanatory, create potions with plants. And there are your other skills as well, like lockpicking, dispelling, which is like a magical form of lockpicking, stealth for sneaking around and getting crits on the people with daggers, all sorts of skills like that. So yeah, as far as character builds go, there's quite a lot of variety in that aspect, and the game is sort of classless. It doesn't really have classes per se, and that's where the destiny system comes in. You can, depending on the stats that you have, whether you're going for might, finesse, sorcery, or any combination of those, even all three at once, as you get to different thresholds of those by unlocking skills in the tree, you will unlock new destinies, and these destinies take the form of almost like tarot-like cards that each have different names, and you can equip those to give yourself a bonus. So like, for instance, in my character right now is a Warlock, which is like the tier 4 finesse/sorcery destiny. So when you have like 25 each or 30 each of finesse and sorcery, you can become a Warlock, which replaces your dodge roll with a poisonous blink and gives you like a big increase to your piercing damage and your elemental damage and some other stuff like that. So they're basically like classes, but you can change them at will, and they're based entirely on the stats that you have. So that means that pretty much any combination of armors, weapons, skills, and stats is viable and does actually have a named sort of class destiny that you can choose for it, which is a nice touch and helps to increase the combat variety in the game even more. My only big overarching complaint with the gameplay itself is that there's a lot of hit stun on your character. It's really easy to get comboed to death by bosses and things because when your character gets smacked by something, you can't move or dodge or retaliate for like a good couple seconds, it feels like sometimes. It's probably more like 1 second, but it's a very long second. And it can lead to you, especially in areas where there's one really hard enemy and a couple of smaller enemies, getting hounded by those smaller enemies and like hit stunned while the big thing winds up its huge attack that normally you would have no problem evading, but since once you get hit, you can't evade for like a good period of time. It's a bit like the Capra Demon boss fight in that regard, where like small nippy enemies stagger you long enough to get slammed by something huge and killed. And the combat is fast and kinetic and fluid enough to where it feels immediately strange to have such a long wind down and hit stun period on attacks that kind of makes the combat feel a bit more sluggish than it should sometimes. So most of the time it's responsive and nice, but occasionally it feels like you're taking forever to respond and you're fighting in molasses because the hit stun is so long. That's really my only complaint with the combat. Something I would have liked to have seen though in the remaster is some work done on the interface, especially like the inventory and stuff like that. They're all very much like an older interface that's meant for like 720p screens with like lots of lists and wasted space, and I feel like they could have done a lot to these interfaces to modernize them and make them more pleasant to use. But unfortunately, the remaster does not extend to the interface. It would have been nice, especially because like some of them, especially like the quests and sometimes the crafting and the inventory especially, are a bit rough to use. And they could have been better. It would have been nice if they were transformed into like grid-based tabbed interfaces or something to make them more modern and nice looking. I feel like that would have been a much more noticeable change than like a small graphical update to actually alter how you interface with the game, because you know it's an RPG, you're going to be in menus a lot, so that would have been nice. Also, it is a little bit buggy sometimes. I've noticed two major bugs. One where sometimes you get stuck in place for no reason, like there's nothing in front of you or around you, you're not stuck in the ground or anything, you just can't move, you'll run in place, dodging doesn't work, and you have to like save and reload the game in order to fix it. I don't know what's up with that. It's only happened to me twice, but still it has happened. And the other one is the camera in this game has a weird bug associated with it I've never seen in any game ever, where it sometimes spazzes out in combat so much that it actually teleports you to a different place. It's kind of crazy. It's happened to me like 5 or 6 times. And sometimes you'll be in combat just smacking dudes around and suddenly it'll like glitch into the ground so hard that you end up like on a platform somewhere across the dungeon, a different location. It's really weird. It's actually glitched out so hard once that it caused a boss to for some reason get stuck under the ground, and I had to reload the game in order to actually finish that fight. So yeah, the camera is a bit buggy in this game, and I think it needs a little bit of work for stability. It's not like an every combat it screws up kind of bug, but it still happens more often than it should, for sure. But I guess what that really leads us up to is, does Amalur still hold up? Is it still a good game? And in my opinion, yes, it is actually. It's a bit glitchy here and there, but it is a solid open world RPG with a lot of combat variety, a ton of quests to do, and a really large world to explore that actually has stuff to see in it. It doesn't feel empty. It's very much in the vein of like a Fable-y open world, so if you're in the mood for something like that, this is a really good one to actually scratch that itch. And if you're looking for a long RPG to help tide you over before Cyberpunk or something, then look no further, because this game is extremely large. Like seriously, if you want to do everything, you're looking at like 80 hours-ish, thereabouts from what I recall. And this, of course, does include the Legend of Dead Kell DLC expansion thingy in the game by default, and you can tackle that once you're level 10 for even more stuff to do. So it is huge, it is absolutely loaded with things, and if you're looking for just like a long questing experience, well, you got it. And also, something I've never seen before in a remaster that I'm kind of jazzed for, because I think it seems like a really nice pro-consumer idea, they're actually talking about making a new DLC expansion for this game, now that it's remastered. I think that's really cool. I don't think that's ever happened before. I don't think a remaster of a game has ever... It's to revive interest in the game, either for a sequel or because people liked it and want to be able to play it on modern systems or something. But for a fairly recent game, I mean 2012 isn't that recent, but it's close enough, it's not ancient, to actually instead have it like revive interest for new DLC, for new content to be made for it, that's kind of neat, and I'm actually excited to see what they come up with, because I think that's a really cool idea going forward. If we see more remasters of especially RPGs and stuff that can be added onto like that really effectively, it might be a neat experience to be able to actually have new minds make new stuff for an older game and see what happens. So yeah, that's pretty cool. That is Kingdoms of Amalur Re-Reckoning. The link, as always, is in the description below this video to the Steam page if you want to go check it out yourself. I think it's a really solid RPG. Honestly, it still has some of the problems that the original had, but with that level scaling difference, the looting difference, it makes it a bit more of an enjoyable experience. The world is nice. I like Gaelic mythology though, so I might be a little bit biased. And yeah, I think it's actually worth jumping into if you've never played it before. This is a good opportunity to do that. So thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.